rule. He changed the state's name to Yugoslavia and split it into 9 new provinces.
The effect of this effectively was to get rid of any historically based province of Bosnia and Herzegovina. The Bosnian Muslims were all split up, and this was a bad thing for them because it meant that they had far fewer chances of any sort of political power. Now, this all seems rather relevant today.
Alexander's royal dictatorship was hardly a success. In 1934, he was planning to try and return the country to democracy when...
The assassin's bullet has scarred the political map of Yugoslavia once again. This afternoon, King Alexander and the French foreign minister had been shot. Petrus Kellerman, believed to be a Macedonian nationalist, jumped on the running board of the car carrying them and opened fire. Both died immediately.
But killing the king didn't stop the mangling of Bosnia. In August 1939, Serb and Croat leaders made an agreement which, for the first time in modern history, gave Croatia autonomy within Yugoslavia, but at the expense of Bosnia.
It was, if you like, the first carve-up by the Serbs and the Croats of Bosnia.
It gave western Herzegovina to Croatia, large parts of northeastern Bosnia to Croatia, and the area around Bihać to Croatia. It was, from the point of view of the Croats, a very, very good deal, and certainly one which contemporary Croats would be very happy to have offered to them again.
But beyond Yugoslav borders emerged the forces that would reshape the Balkans yet again. Yugoslavia found itself as ever on the fault line. Uncomfortably so, because Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria and Albania signed up to the Nazi-led Axis and were all intent on expanding. Although the Yugoslav government declared itself neutral, its real position emerged when, 2 years later, in March 1941, it accepted Axis control. But the masses rejected the path of slavery to the Nazis. The Yugoslav government was overthrown in a coup. Hitler responded immediately. The Führer is determined to destroy Yugoslavia. Within days, Axis troops invaded and overran it. The war will be very popular in Italy, Hungary and Bulgaria, as acquisition of territory can be promised to these states. The Nazis set up the puppet independent state of Croatia, which included all of Bosnia and Herzegovina. The chief puppets were the vicious Ustashi, a band of Croat nationalists led by the notorious Ante Pavelić.
The Ustashi, once in power in Croatia, embarked upon their radical program of what we can now, I guess, call legitimately ethnic cleansing.
The movement of the Ustashi is based on religion, said one Ustashi minister. For the minorities, Serbs, Jews and Gypsies, we have 3 million bullets. We shall kill one part of the Serbs. We shall transport another, and the rest of them shall be forced to embrace the Roman Catholic religion. Thus, our new Croatia will get rid of all Serbs in our midst in order to become 100% Catholic within 10 years. During everyone else's world war, Yugoslavia fought a brutal civil conflict of its own. On one side were the Serbian nationalists called Chetniks. They began as an anti-Nazi resistance movement backed by the British. On the other side, the Croat Ustashi made even the Nazis quail with their savagery. Great deeds were done by Germans and Croats together. We can proudly say that we succeeded in breaking the Serb nation, which, after the English, is the most thick-headed, the most stubborn and the most stupid.
The regime that came to power in Croatia and Bosnia was indeed so vicious and genocidal indeed against the Serbs, the Jews. It also killed many Muslims and Croats, that it soon lost the support of the majority of the population and continued to rule as indeed a terrorist, a repressive regime running concentration camps, pogrom campaigns. It was this that in many ways drove large numbers of people into the partisan movement.
The partisans were communist guerrillas, headed by one Josip Broz, better known as Tito.
During the war, the success of the partisan movement is precisely to be explained on the grounds that they were neither rabid nationalists on the Croatian nor on the Serbian side. The partisans presented themselves as a force which could precisely bridge various gaps between national identities.
But For the Serbian Chetniks, the communists were the problem, not the solution. Gradually they began collaborating with the Ustashi and the Axis forces, massacring thousands of partisans and Muslims. Seeing the way the wind was blowing, the Allies decided to switch their support to Tito's partisans. The British sent in arms and officers, including one captain, Evelyn Waugh. Meanwhile, Tito set up liberation committees, recognizing the national rights of all Yugoslavia's different peoples. It was the beginnings of a covert communist government. But Churchill was interested in beating Hitler, not the future of Yugoslavia. The less we worry about the form of government they set up, the better. That is for them to decide. What interests us is which of them is doing most harm to the Germans. By 1942, the partisans had got control around Europe's dividing line, the Drina River. Outnumbered 6-1, they repelled assault after assault from the Germans and their allies. Until in the autumn of 1944, the Red Army, advancing from the east, came to help them finish the liberation. Together, they took Belgrade. The communists had won the war for Yugoslavia. Now they could inherit the peace, a united nation that they could design. Our national liberation struggle was a victory not only over fascism, but over those who oppressed and aimed to continue oppressing the peoples of Yugoslavia. The divided world was again at peace, but the Cold War was about to open a new ideological fault line across the globe. The new Federal People's Republic of Yugoslavia stood with one foot on each side.
You can see the last Essential Guide this Thursday at 9. Tonight at 11:45, visual artist Patrick Hughes offers a shifting perspective on war in Bosnia. Writers from former Yugoslavia and Guardian journalists have contributed to a special Channel 4 booklet which explains the background to the current conflict. For your copy, send a cheque or postal order for £4.95 and made payable to Channel 4 to Bloody Bosnia, PO Box 4000, London W3 6XJ.
Churchill said people will afterwards think how we cynically decided the fate of millions of people.
First-hand accounts trace the beginning of the end for Churchill as leader. Next Wednesday at 7 on BBC Two.
That man, how can I stand it? But where would we be without him?
Now on BBC Two, an open space special. Michael Foot has made a film highlighting the plight of the people living in conflict in the former Yugoslavia. The film contains graphic and harrowing news footage of the casualties of war.
There was a very important moment, a significant moment for me when Sir Edward Heath, the former Prime Minister, supposedly the great European, rose up at Prime Minister's question time and asked the Prime Minister, or rather pleaded with the Prime Minister, that he should be absolutely clear that Britain would take no further action in the former Yugoslavia and in Bosnia. And as Edward Heath pleaded for inaction, there was a huge murmur arose in the House of Commons, mainly on the government benches, but I'm sorry to say partly on the opposition benches too. And I thought, that's it, that's the murmur of Munich. And that's the moment I knew when, sadly, there was not a majority in the House of Commons to enforce United Nations resolutions and to bring an end to the terrible atrocity in Bosnia.
Here we're dealing with an attempt to extinguish
an internationally recognized sovereign state, with all that that implies and all the signals that gives out for the so-called New World Order, and of course compounded with the fact that this has been seen by many as a failure to come to the rescue of a minority group of Europeans, the Bosnian Muslims, in the same way that we failed to come to the rescue of a minority group of Europeans, the German Jews, before the last war. It has so many awful echoes of the Holocaust and of the attitude of appeasement.
Those MPs have been talking about the biggest event which has happened in Europe since 1945. But somehow our leading politicians don't want us to see and understand what's really been happening. They would have us believe that the people of Yugoslavia had always been afflicted with deep ethnic feuds, and that the republics, especially Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia-Herzegovina and Serbia, had only been held together under the discipline of communism. The visitors who flocked into the country saw only the most favorable aspects of communism. They delighted in the sights and sounds, and especially in the indigenous culture. These visitors contributed in abundance to the prosperity of this poor but beautiful country. They could not have realized that the valuable currency earned by the local Slovenes and Croats went straight to Belgrade, capital of Serbia. This in turn had lined the pockets of communist bureaucrats rather than those of the workers. Their leader, Marshal Joseph Broz Tito, wielded absolute power. But since he had split from Stalin, the West helped him to build a military force strong enough to resist a Russian invasion. The cost of maintaining this huge army fell most unfairly and mainly on the Slovenes, the Croats, and the Bosnians of Bosnia-Herzegovina. They resented the cost all the more because the army, especially the officer class, was dominated by Serbs, as was the hated secret police and embassies all over the world. By the time Tito died in 1980, the republics of Yugoslavia were seething with discontent. Many of those present would soon be thinking of Tito as the only man who could have held Yugoslavia together. But even he could not have prevented the collapse of communism. The Slovenes and the Croats now looked to the West for their future. They wanted to try democracy and to join the common market. The elected leader of the Croats, Franjo Tudjman, had made his name as the youngest general in Tito's army of anti-fascist partisans, and also as a prominent communist. Having fulfilled every condition laid down by the West for truly democratic elections, the democratic parties were swept into power. The jubilant electors, Slovenes and Croats, now confidently expected to be welcomed into the brotherhood of European nations like prodigal sons. Slobodan Milosevic, president of Serbia, has achieved power partly as the result of a minor coup. He secured the backing of the Federal Army generals. He has also taken over complete control of radio and television. He appeals to an upsurge of nationalism which calls for a greater Serbia, an old idea based on the notion that wherever lives a Serb, there lies Serbian land. The academic promoters of this doctrine tell how the greater Serbia has to be ethnically cleansed.
They can't do any more archaeological excavations. because they can't find anything more than Serbian remains. Whoever comes to you and says these borders are his, he's coming here to conquer the Serbian land. Therefore, you have the right to kill him.
Propaganda blasted from Belgrade denounces every Croat as an Ustashi, meaning fascist. Shrewd, affable, insanely ambitious and fluent in English, Milosevic seems to possess a sinister fascination for English politicians. In a Nazi-like putsch, he had already established a vicious police state in Kosovo based on ethnic cleansing, but leading Western politicians took no notice. As soon as the Slovenes and the Croats announced their independence, Milosevic started the war. He bungled an attack on Slovenia, but after the humiliation he turned his attention to Croatia. His military strategy consists of first bombarding his target from the air, then the troops pound the area with long-range missiles. After a while, the tanks move in, followed by swarms of militiamen. Terrible acts of brutality and looting have taken place within these homes. We see only the after effects when nothing has been left worth a price on the black market. Leaders of the European Union decided to send the British nominee, Lord Carrington, to intervene between what they called the warring factions. Diligently, he drew up one agreement after another for a ceasefire, each of which Milosevic eagerly signed and just as eagerly broke. Nothing compared in horror to the siege of Vukovar.
They wanted to rob them of their past, their history, their memories, their identity. They wanted to make it as if they had never existed. They burned their books, their archives, their records, their manuscripts, their registers of births and deaths, all in the name of ethnic cleansing. They smashed their ancient monuments, even their gravestones and their churches, always their churches. But they could not kill the spirit of the people of Vukovar. Against the cruelest of killing machines, they held out day after day, night after night, for as many as 90 days and nights. The Serbs boasted tomorrow Vukovar will fall, but the people would not surrender. No one came out of the cellars and begged for mercy. No one came out of cellars until the beautiful town of Vukovar was no more.
The Serbs crowed over their victory as if they had routed a force as heavily armed as themselves. Despite all the evidence to the contrary, the Serbs often accused their victims of killing their own people.
It's not Croatian territory, it's the territory of Yugoslavia. And the fact is, those Croatian forces, they are the ones who've killed, strangled and massacred the people who are living here.
They have killed all our friends, and we are not guilty. We didn't want the war. We only love people. We don't kill them. And we still don't hate. We still don't hate.
I said early to people over whom I would have hoped to have had some influence that I thought as the hostilities got worse and worse and more Croatians were being killed and massacred, that it would have been right to recognize Croatia and Slovenia as independent. Then we should have been in a position to supply them legally with arms with which to defend themselves.
The Germans agreed, thinking it undemocratic to deprive Slovenia and Croatia of their right to sovereignty. They promptly established embassies in both countries. But the British clung to the hope that Yugoslavia could still be united under Serb domination.
First they said you have to have multi-party elections. Then you have to build a society with open market and respect human rights. And these were the three, let's say, duties that we have to, fulfill in order to join the family of democratic nations. And we obeyed. If I say obeyed, we did it. And when we did it, it's not okay. So what about this?
The French called for more effective intervention. In response, the United Nations Security Council imposed an arms embargo on all the republics of former Yugoslavia. But the Croats were virtually defenseless, while the Federal Army generals boasted that they had stockpiled enough to keep the war going for another 6 years. Their superior technology enabled them to conquer with the greatest of ease a third of Croatia. They also wrecked, wantonly and senselessly wrecked, most of the show villages within the Dubrovnik region. The question arose whether Dubrovnik itself would be attacked. The city had been designated of cultural importance to the whole world. Over 100 nations, including Britain, had signed the UNESCO Declaration to ensure the protection of the city in the event of war.
When the Dubrovnik was attacked, it was the sign for the Europe and for the politicians. Here is something dangerous. For me, that's the same like when Hitler was attacking Czech. It's necessary to stop this aggressor.
The United Nations sent monitors to Dubrovnik, hoping that their conspicuous presence would deter the aggressors. But it was the aggressors who deterred the monitors.
And it was Dubrovnik, I think, that put the war against Croatia onto the front pages of newspapers rather than the inside pages here. And then we shifted and quite often talked about the destruction to the cultural heritage rather than, as we were doing before, was talking to the suffering of the people. If palaces and monasteries get destroyed, that arouses interest.
It did not help that the British government, and indeed other governments, saying over and over again, very, very clearly, that they would never risk a single troop on the ground, because what clearer green light or go-ahead could there be for the Serbs in their policy of conquest and aggression than that.
Compared with Vukovar, casualties were small, about 100, most of them civilians. The residents thought it an outrage that anyone should be killed at all. I asked the Foreign Office to send in a food ship. The junior minister, Douglas Hogg, thought it would be an act of war. He had no need to be so timid. The Italians had already sent in a food ship. The Battle of Dubrovnik was one the Serbs did not win. Perhaps they were unaware of just how short of weapons the defenders of the city really were. After the siege, I went to Dubrovnik myself. I wanted to find out more about the war and to see what had happened to our friends.
Very nice to see you. Thank you for letting us come up here. There wouldn't have been any hope for the city if they got this.
No, it would be, well, we were quite hopeless. With them, say 500 meters from here, on both sides of the fortress. So this was like an island.
And so how many were you here during the time when they were surrounding it?
There were about 30.
30?
Yes.
30 you held the whole thing?
Yes.
At the...
Much to their dismay.
Uh-huh.
And much to their shame.
This was the place from which the Serbs shelled Dubrovnik day after day, night after night, just down there. They, on this bleak mountain top, they offered an easy target if only some brave men in the West had come to the aid of Croatia.
It could be stopped at that time without any complications. That situation was very, very easy. Now it's more complicated, but anyhow, as a principal, aggressor must be stopped.
Well, it should have been dealt with in a very firm and resolute way at the time that Dubrovnik was being shelled. I mean, the fact is, over Slovenia, there was an excuse for the West to take some action, but they didn't. But when Dubrovnik, which was after all a World Heritage Site, one of the great cities of Europe, was being bombarded by the Serbs, here was the time when we should have said enough, no more. And I had a debate in the small hours of the morning in December 1991. It was the first time the Yugoslav crisis was actually discussed in Parliament, 3:20 a.m. And I urged the Foreign Office Minister to be resolute, and let's have an air patrol, a naval patrol, and let's tell these people that they cannot get away with it. And of course, what happened? There was pussyfooting, there was no action, and so the Serbs felt that they could continue to call the bluff.
The attack on Dubrovnik and the destruction of Dubrovnik was not something that happened, as it were, by chance. It was, after all, one cultural monument that everybody in the West knew. Tourists were aware of Yugoslavia primarily through the images of Dubrovnik, and therefore the Yugoslav army generals knew that this was the test case. If they were going to go away from Dubrovnik after the bombing with impunity, everything else would have been allowed, and indeed has been allowed.
What do you say about the story told in London and the West that this was a civil war?
That is not true. You know, the truth is that was a mere aggression, because they came like barbarians, plundering, devastating, burning the villages, taking the prisoners, taking minors to the prisoners. Where are the military targets here? Where are the military targets? There is not a single military target in this innocent, beautiful landscape.
Kathy Wilkes sometimes lectures at the Intercity University, so she had stayed here throughout the siege. I told her that our government blames the Croats and the Slovenes for starting the war, that they should never have declared their independence.
Both Slovenia and Croatia were the republics that contributed most to the federal budget. In fact, one of the cruel ironies of this war is that Croatia probably paid for a very, very high percentage of the equipment with which it was attacked. I think that both countries very much resented paying quite so much to keep Kosovo in subjection. Because before the war, in 1990 or thereabouts, about 25 of the gross national product of former Yugoslavia went into keeping Kosovo down. And of course, nobody really would wish to see their money misused. in such a way.
By this time, people wanted to know whether Carrington had any ideas for stopping the war.
But everything depends upon the ceasefire. And after 12 ceasefires, one cannot be very optimistic that it will hold.
Lord Carrington seemed so unperturbed by the ceaseless breaking of ceasefires that the United Nations sent their own negotiator, Cyrus Vance, to see what he could do. He succeeded in establishing a temporary peace by endorsing the status quo. He brought in United Nations troops to guard the new frontier. This effectively prevented the Croats from retrieving their own territory. Though Milosevic had lost the Battle of Dubrovnik, he had cause for satisfaction. He had conquered a third of Croatia, wrecked its economy, killed over 9,000 people, made nearly 250,000 homeless, had smashed over 400 Catholic churches, and had shown what he meant by ethnic cleansing, which is, of course, fascism. Our leaders realized at last that they had no alternative but to follow Germany's lead by acknowledging what they should have foreseen as inevitable, the independence of Slovenia and Croatia. The Croats were overjoyed to become members of the United Nations. Sarajevo, a former Olympic city, capital of Bosnia-Herzegovina, is one of the most genuinely cosmopolitan cities in the world. The population consists of a majority of Muslims, but also of Croats, Serbs, Hungarians, Jews, and the children of mixed marriages. The people think of themselves primarily as Bosnians. This famous paper, run to this day by a Muslim, Croat, Serb, and Jew, reflects the ethnic and religious tolerance of the people. What greater proof can there be than this strange mixture of holy places standing so closely together? The mosque beside the Catholic Church, the synagogue by the Orthodox Church. All these monuments have remained undamaged and respected by everyone, some since the Middle Ages. The Bosnians, seeing what had happened to Croatia and having no desire to be swallowed up in a greater Serbia, now called for their own independence. 65% of the population, including a great many Serbs, voted in favor. The country was promptly recognized as a sovereign state. Leader of the Bosnians, President Alija Izetbegovic, was totally unprepared for war, but having achieved national status, he knew that his country had the right under the United Nations Charter to protection from the great powers in the event of an invasion. He was perhaps a little naive in thinking that leading politicians abide by their agreements. But after all, they had gone to the rescue of Kuwait
all the heavy weapons
to uphold, they said, the principles of the Charter.
Missiles and so on.
And Kuwait was not even a democracy.
Control of UN.
The Federal Army lost no time in launching an attack on Sarajevo. With the weight of aerial bombardment, tanks, long-range missiles, landmines and mortar fire, they smashed their way into all parts of the country. Further propaganda blasted from Belgrade denounced every Muslim as an extremist intent on poisoning Europe with Islamic fundamentalism. To maintain the arms embargo, now that the republics were recognized as sovereign states, was a flagrant violation of Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, which decrees that no nation may be deprived of the right of self-defense in the event of an armed invasion into its territory. A visit to Bosnia did nothing to shake Douglas Hurd's belief in Milosevic as the man with whom he could do business. President Clinton took a more realistic view of the situation.
Imposition of the arms embargo by the United Nations before actually this country was even created and recognized had the unintended consequence of giving the Serbs an insurmountable military advantage, which they have pressed with ruthless efficiency.
No government was more opposed to lifting the arms embargo than the British.
But it was far away from reality, because on one side you had heaps of arms. Everybody was talking about the fourth military power in Europe, and now you actually, by banning us to provide ourselves with arms, they actually approved of the Serbian aggression.
As one of the commanders in there said to me, "This is the weapon that I have," and he showed me a pistol and one ammunition clip left. My opposite number on that side has got howitzers. But I think they're doing a pretty good job trying to hold a very difficult position. What should we do to help them? I think there is more that we can do to assist them. The question for us is quite simple. Are we prepared to allow the Muslim community in Bosnia-Herzegovina to be wiped out?
Surely our leaders must have known that their policies gave these volunteers for the defense of their own country little chance of survival.
And then they accuse us of being this and that. But, I mean, gentlemen, we must live.
The attitude of our Foreign Secretary, Douglas Hurd, and of some other politicians was bizarre. They imposed sanctions on Serbia in sudden recognition, apparently, that they were the aggressors, yet they still refused to admit that the Croats and the Bosnians were the victims of aggression.
People were very confused. And when there was talk of warring factions, they thought, oh, they're all as bad as each other. But of course, that again is a monstrous lie. I mean, of course, in any war, there are terrible things committed on all sides. And I wouldn't say that there are no atrocities committed by Muslims. That would be manifestly absurd and patently untrue. But this war was in origin a war of aggression by Serbia, and the vast majority of the atrocities have been committed by Serbia.
They killed all peoples. Some peoples from the Serbian forces have something like a wire put on the neck and pull.
Some people supported Hitler in every country he conquered, so some of the Serbs living in Bosnia supported the idea of a greater Serbia. For the citizens of Sarajevo, it was almost more frightening having to contend with the snipers in their midst than with aerial bombardment. The secessionist Serbs found a leader in Radovan Karadzic. Though dependent upon fuel, food tanks and military guidance from Belgrade, he saw himself as something of a rival to Milosevic and no less keen on a greater Serbia.
Could take the city tomorrow, couldn't we? Anytime. We could take it anytime.
The violence aroused public concern. Questions were asked. Why couldn't the war be stopped? What was the purpose of NATO? The Americans threatened airstrikes, and the bombing stopped, but it started again as soon as the threat was seen to be mere words. This is not, and never was, a civil war. It was mainly an unprovoked attack upon unarmed civilians by a heavily armed military force. It was genocide. as President Izetbegovic always insisted. How is it possible that we should have allowed such sights as these to be seen again in this century?
I think it's been one of the most shameful episodes in Europe's contemporary history, because I think what has happened here is that Europe has betrayed an idea of itself. You know, that what you have is a government, the Bosnian government, that has claimed to wish to uphold European values, values of pluralism and tolerance and multi-ethnicity and so on. And against this government has been ranged a viciously nationalistic, racist and murderous, aggressive force. And what Europe has done basically is to enable that murderous, racist, aggressive force to have its way to a very large extent.
Accusations of impotence prompted the UN to send humanitarian aid to villages cut off from the outside world. No one questioned the courage of the United Nations troops, but having to operate under their absurd mandate never to use force put them at the mercy of paramilitaries at checkpoints. For permission to pass, they demanded a price in fuel and cash. Since the Serbs were in the majority, they forced the UN to contribute to the Greater Serbia.
At the moment, you have troops with the most sophisticated weaponry that we've ever known, armed to the teeth with the latest in high-tech, being stopped by a band of unshaven brigands with knives and Kalashnikovs. They're being forced to behave like chocolate cream soldiers and not to use all this weaponry that they have.
We've got to establish the precedent and the fact that if thugs on any side try to stop food and medicine getting through, then on behalf of the rest of us, we should force the supplies through. That is the thing that hasn't happened, and that's what's brought the United Nations into disrepute.
Prime Minister John Major appointed Lord Owen to draw up a plan for a just peace.
The new countries that are emerging in what was formerly Yugoslavia have to live within Europe, and they have to live with the reality of the European community. And the European community was founded on democratic principles. It will not accept ethnic cleansing. It will not accept racist pressures. It will not accept that you can achieve territory by force of arms. These are principles which we will stick to not just for weeks or months, but for years.
But he did accept a change in territory by force of arms. He did accept racist pressures, and he did accept ethnic cleansing, meaning apartheid. He and Cyrus Vance drew up a plan to ensure that Muslims, Croats and Serbs lived apart.
Of course, it couldn't work because there weren't, in fact, free, separated communities in Bosnia. All these people lived almost everywhere in the country, and about 50% of the total population of Bosnia is in a mixed marriage or in a mixed family. Owen saw that it was crucial for the acceptance of the Serb demands that the Bosnian resistance should be weakened. Owen Vance's plan offered an extraordinarily generous amount of Bosnia to the Croats. Now, by getting Tudjman to agree to this and think that somehow he could recoup his losses to Serbia by taking over Western Bosnia, what we can call the alliance between Muslims and Croats, which had held back Serb aggression, broke down.
Muslims and Croats were caught in confined spaces each claimed as their own. They now turned on each other in a real civil war, mercifully only temporary. The fight reached its fiercest in the beautiful town of Mostar. Breaches in the arms embargo did not enable the Muslims or Croats to match the firepower of the Serbs, though both managed to capture a few heavy weapons.
Держи! Айде! Бърже, айде! Дигни ръка!
The famous bridge of Mostar, built in 1563, at last gave way to the shells of the Croats, to the horror of many Croats themselves. While the Croats who lived in Bosnia fought the Muslims, the Croats who lived in Croatia offered the Muslims safety and shelter. On and on they came, and not only Muslims, but all those who called themselves Bosnians. The heavily armed secessionist Serbs easily conquered 2/3 of Bosnia-Herzegovina. The sight on our screens of the shelling of the bread queue, later the massacre in the marketplace of Sarajevo, shocked the world. Never were our leaders so contemptible as when they pretended not to know whether perhaps it had been the Muslims themselves who had been responsible for the massacre. Again, people asked, why can't the war be stopped? Our leaders, having no policy of their own, could only respond to the public outcry. The threat of airstrikes, unless the Serbs removed themselves and their artillery from the mountains surrounding Sarajevo, worked, actually worked.
Every time the Americans or NATO or anybody has threatened the Serbs with airstrikes, they have panicked and backed away. They've done it every single time that Clinton or whoever has said boo to them. The trouble is, having said boo to them, the next week we say, oh, we didn't really mean boo, we meant kind of sort of boo. You know, and of course they laugh.
And again, the reaction of Owen and the reaction of a British government was to do nothing, to say, well, we aren't quite sure who put the shell. Perhaps it came, perhaps the Muslims shelled themselves. But the credible threat immediately worked. The Serbs are not prepared to be engaged in a military conflict with the West.
We cannot have security in this country except within the framework of international law that we're prepared to defend.
It's the duty of each generation is to leave a better world behind. I'm not sure at all if these generations, again talking about new order in the world, are leaving a better world behind.
Again, the planners divided Bosnia into 3 ethnic groups and awarded the Serbs 2/3 of the territory they had conquered.
When it is put to Owen that this plan is monstrously unjust, it is indeed, as he said himself, made in hell, he doesn't deny that. But he says, well, the international community is not prepared to stand up to the Serbs, therefore all I can do is to negotiate something in which is acceptable to the Serbs, and that's what he has tried to do from the start. But when then there is any chance of there being effective military intervention, every single time Owen has opposed it.
Now comes the supposedly final plan, backed by Britain, France, Russia, Germany and America. Under the heavy weight of this pressure, Bosnia is asked to accept defeat, while Serbia is to be allowed to retain half of Bosnia-Herzegovina.
it gives fewer than 30% of a population, half the country, and more than 70% of a population, the other half. It hands over to Mr. Karadzic important areas where Muslims were a large absolute majority in the past, and it ensures, in consequence, that at least 1 million people, now refugees, can never return to their homes. The contact group plan is in reality a washout. It is no way to peace in Bosnia. And if we accept it and we go on backing it, all we are doing is to back, legitimize ethnic cleansing, injustice, forced labor camps, mass rape. That, in reality, is what the contact group plan means.
Well, I think, ethnic cleansing as a term, it seems to me to be the ugliest term to arrive in European history since Final Solution. That's to say, it uses a term which is supposed to be about benefit, cleansing, making things clean. Whereas actually it's a term about nightmare. It's a term about murdering people. It's a term whose meaning is that, as we have seen horrifying footage coming out of these countries, ethnic cleansing means soldiers bayoneting open the stomachs of pregnant women in order to kill their babies and them.
Once they brought in new women, and one of them was pregnant. I thought she was 5 months pregnant. They raped her and pushed her on the floor. She fell down when they beat her, screaming and crying. She struggled with them, but one of them slashed her on the body with the tip of a knife. The blood flowed out and she was screaming, "Kill me to save me."
One of the groups in the country on which it has impacts the most ferociously is the female population.
They lifted me up and tied me to a wall. Then 3 of them raped me. They wanted me to say I'm a Serb. I didn't want to show them 3 fingers. They tugged my hair and glued the symbol of 3 fingers on me. Everyone who came here was raped. During that time, I don't know how many times it happened to me.
When it means that, fathers have to construct the beds, make the beds in which their daughters are then raped and killed. And that happens because they simply don't have the weapons to defend their homes and their towns and their cities. Then it becomes impossible to think of ourselves as civilized people.
It was the most ghastly thing to see and hear them raping the youngest girl. The little girl was young, around 7 years old, with her mother. Then he grabbed the girl and said to her, "It's your turn to be stretched by a Serb." Then he lifted up her T-shirt, tore it, and tried to do it through it. One lay upon her and wanted to rape her. He said something like, "It won't work." He said, "If we can't do it, we'll kill her." Then they shot her many times.
Mama mi je baš tude bila čepala. Tako je ona pala i nisam vidio nju, samo je bila ovako odstavljena i nisam vidio nju, a tad sam vidio ovako leži i raznesena mu doze noga i vidim okreće glavu i pogleda u meni i onda vratio glavu i unesvijestio.
What does one say to the growing up children of murdered parents? What does one say to them? How does one persuade the children of the Bosnians to accept European values when Europe is what has murdered their parents? How does